The superfight is on. On today's show, we preview the colossal clash at UFC 226, where light heavyweight champion Daniel Cormier steps up to face the baddest man on the planet, Stipe Miocic. In what is set to be the biggest matchup of 2018, the most dominant heavyweight champion in UFC history puts his title on the line against a determined DC, who has a chance at making history by becoming a two-division champion. Hello and welcome to UFC Inside the Octagon. John Gooden alongside Dan Hardy, and we are about to get into the biggest fight of 2018 for the UFC heavyweight title. Dan, UFC 226 is upon us. I cannot wait for this one. For the title, the baddest man on the planet. History, for the belt, for all the honours.
Yes, yeah, and you know, for all the bragging rights as well. You know, this is a big step for DC. Obviously, there was some disappointment around John Jones being removed from competition because that was really where he wanted to prove himself. But if he goes up to heavyweight and takes the heavyweight title, he's basically done what John Jones was setting out to do. So it kind of trumps that whole problem. You know what I mean? It puts DC right at the top of the tree. Yeah. It rockets him right up the pound-for-pound rankings, and he will have beaten the most dominant heavyweight champion that we've seen. So there's so much to be gained here for DC, but alternatively so much to be lost here for Miocic. So we'll talk about it later, but I think that affects their motivation going into this as well.
I'm interested in hearing about it. Right, well, let's set it up with the facts and the stats, shall we? Because I know that we have no filler here. All of this is absolute gold. I'm going to highlight just those because I think they're important. Dan, do you agree?
Yeah, they are massively important. You know, I mean, an 8-inch reach advantage is absolutely massive in any weight class. But what's interesting here is that Miocic doesn't really use his reach to the fullest extent. So the times where DC's fought guys, and John Jones an 84.5-inch reach, so he's worked against guys that have got a longer reach than Miocic.
Probably his whole career, actually.
Most definitely, yeah. The difference here is that Miocic doesn't really use his reach. He's actually got much better short-range power. And, you know, and the height as well, it's never really been a detriment to DC because his whole game revolves around being so close to you that it kind of nullifies your advantages anyway.
Let's consider everything on the bottom half of the screen then, Dan. All stats relevant to heavyweight fights, and they're brilliantly impressive for Stipe and DC.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's even more impressive for me is that when he stepped into that Strikeforce heavyweight tournament, he wasn't one of the original fighters. He came in as an alternate. He was actually working as a coach at the time and kind of almost stumbled upon an MMA career, found himself in this tournament and clearly brought a lot of things to the table that the heavyweight division either wasn't ready for or hadn't yet seen. And you know, a lot of it down to his work rate, his tenacity, which we'll cover in a second. But you know, clearly the height discrepancy when it comes to DC and most heavyweights has not held him back up to this point in his career. I mean, you know, undefeated at heavyweight, he ran through those guys. And then when he moved down to light heavyweight, he was able to bring that same kind of force and tenacity into that division and overwhelm some of the best guys in that weight class as well.
Yeah, let's take a look at a second page so we can get into some more finite detail here. What do you make of this, Dan? I know that we've pored over these stats before we got into the studio, and you have like a calculation out of this, which means something.
Well, yeah. I mean, if we look at obviously strikes landed per minute, it is in Stipe's favour. But then if you take into account their average fight length, Stipe's doing quicker work, faster, without having to expend so much energy, without needing as much time. We know that DC's a grinder. He likes to wear people down. And although we've seen Miocic can do that very well, we've also seen him with that single punch knockout power, which obviously does elevate these stats. Now, when we come down to the takedown side of it, DC's more effective in the takedown range, but obviously he's using less takedowns per 15 minutes. But what that may tell me is that in a 15-minute fight, he needs less takedowns to hold the person on the floor. He's probably technically superior in that range to Stipe, so his takedown accuracy is higher, but he also needs less takedowns in order to control that range. Whereas going back and watching Stipe's fights, I very much feel like the takedown offensive in his is more just a part of his game to mix up the striking and keep them guessing and keep them on the back foot. Right. Whereas we know that when DC puts somebody on the floor, he wants to hold them there and beat them up.
Two serious statesmen on the UFC roster there, both champions, of course. Right, let's take it back to a time when DC became a champion as a heavyweight at Strikeforce. Let's turn back the clock and get all nostalgic, shall we?
I love these old school videos. We pull it all out the archives. This is a real good, a short example of what DC was as a heavyweight in Strikeforce. I mean, you can see the size difference with these guys, but the thing that stands out is his speed, his work rate, his aggression, the pressure that he put on these guys. I mean, Josh Barnett, a former heavyweight champion, a guy that has been at the top of the sport for so long, that has experience, that has skills in every range, but just physically couldn't keep up with DC. He was overwhelmed by this kind of pressure. And, you know, we've always heard the tagline for DC, embrace the grind.
Yeah.
He embraces it better than anybody else. He pushes guys back. And these flurries of punches that he's using on people, it forces them to shell up. But then also if he adds in the takedown offensive as well, it really, really keeps these heavyweights guessing. And no offense to the guys in Strikeforce, but they were very much like the old school heavyweights, the big plodding heavyweights that kind of walk people down. And for me, DC fit perfectly into that tournament because he was an unknown commodity to start with, and then the pace that he brought was unmatched by everybody else in the tournament.
Yeah, he really used to say how his speed really helped him out. But he's now facing Stipe Miocic. He's a very different kind of fighter. It's been a long time since he fought at heavyweight as well, and I think that there's been a progression and evolution in the sport. So when the bell sounds, what's the first thing we're going to see from DC?
Okay, well, I think it's important before we even get into this for me to start off by saying I very much feel like this is an uphill battle for DC.
Right.
The reason for that is because the things that Miocic does really well at heavyweight is what DC was doing at light heavyweight, and I feel like the sport's maybe moved on a little bit, and heavyweights are slightly more aggressive. So you've got to think that it's DC going to have to take the initiative in this one. He's going to have to push forward, which, to be honest, is what we would expect from DC. So the first look that you're going to get if you're Miocic, you've got to expect DC to start pushing forward and loop over the top with these big bombarding shots. It's like mortar fire. He throws everything he can, but he also weaves his body from one side to the other. So he constantly keeps his... That's a perfect clip to watch. Watch this. Watch how as he's moving towards Jeff Monson here, you can see his head is shifting off the centre line. So as he's moving forward, there's the centre line. You can see he's constantly dipping off from one side to the other. And then at the same time, he's constantly throwing shots off this as well. So you never get a straight line attack from DC. He's always strafing from one side to the other. And with that rocking momentum, there are big shots coming over the top, which are added to with the power by that shift in weight as well. So it's a very effective way of fighting, and it's very good at overwhelming heavyweights, especially because if you think they're being crowded by this load of fire coming over the top, but at the same time, because it covers so wide a distance, they don't feel like they've got any other option other than to move straight back, which for him is then perfect because they either end up against the fence or they stop still and then he level changes underneath and starts attacking the wrestling. And again, it goes down to speed and tenacity. A lot of heavyweights can't throw like that. They can't throw 4, 5, 6 punch combinations to set up a takedown. Usually you only get those lengthy combinations when they feel like the stoppage is on the way. And they've hit somebody with one good shot, they see they're rocked, and then they throw the combination strikes. DC throws combinations from the first bell to the last bell, and that's really what's defined his career as a heavyweight as well as light heavyweight.
Take a look at Stipe then, who for me is a unique breed of heavyweight fighter, and he tends to do things that a lot of other heavyweight athletes just can't do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, he does what DC does at light heavyweight to heavyweights. You know, we're going to touch on the Ngannou fight in a little while, but in that fight, basically, that was a DC game plan. You know, he looked at Ngannou, he said, OK, he's a big, strong, powerful guy. He's got knockout power, so I need to smother him. I need to stay on his front toe. I need to wear him down. I need to clinch him and beat him up. I need to drag him to the floor. And he does that very well. But at the same time, there are other elements to Stipe's game which makes him incredibly dangerous, and that's the knockout power. Now, the difference with a lot of the people that DC's fought in the past is that they're very rangy fighters. We're talking about John Jones and Gustafsson, namely. They're very rangy fighters, whereas Stipe, although he has the height and reach advantage, the majority of his power shots are very short. That's a great example here against Andrei Arlovski, because as he steps in and lands the clean shot, you can see how close he is. There's usually a 90-degree angle bend in the arm. I mean, that is one of the shortest punches. It very much reminds me of Shane Carwin knocking out Gonzaga. It's like a 6-inch punch. So when he's actually landing these punches, he's so close to them. And if you're DC and you're trying to get inside that punching range, it's much easier to do that against someone that throws long because you can get past their elbow into a safe range and then throw over the top and then threaten takedowns. Whereas if you've got this like little triangle of danger that you've got to step into against Stipe, it makes it very difficult for DC to do that because he's moving through a danger punching range, which normally is a lot further past where his head isn't in the fight. So Stipe having this short range power is actually really beneficial to him. Again, look, I mean, you could even that for Stipe was quite a long range punch. But when it lands, you can see that there's a lot of a bend in the arm still. He's landing with a lot of power at a short range. I mean, he's what, a couple of inches away from the face there, and you can see that there's more than a 90-degree angle in that arm just there. And he's powering through with power. His whole body weight's behind it. I feel like this is a very different fight for DC, and I feel like this is where the danger zone is. Because we know that DC, he's not going to stand on the outside and play counter fighter because he's not got the height or the speed to do it. He's got to crash forward. If he crashes forward, he can't linger in punching range because he can't compare with Stipe's punching power. So if he is in that range, he's got to think about the next step, which is likely the clinch, which is likely the wrestling offensive, which is likely all the things that we know DC is excellent at. But how does he match up with them against Stipe, who we know can punch moving forward and backwards, can punch on one leg with a very short punch. You know, he didn't even expect to land that knockout punch there. That was an opponent that was aggressively crashing forward, as you would expect from DC, that ran on to a very short punch. Pop. I mean, look at that again. It's a 90-degree angle bend in the arm. A lot of the time when these guys are landing with power, it's because they've thrown the punch at such a distance and it's gathered speed and power as it goes. That, again, is a 90-degree angle in the arm as it's landing.
And it's an arm punch, Dan.
It is.
To all intents and purposes. So it's knocking out heavyweight champions with arm punches.
Yeah, moving backwards.
Moving backwards.
Under fire, at speed. You know, even just this performance alone, if you think that's the Stipe that's going to face DC, that immediately, just that one knockout alone causes a lot of problems for DC because he can't recklessly charge forward. I mean, slipping his head from one side to the other to stay off the centre line is very valuable. But at the same time, if you slip him from one side to the other and the guy's got long-range punches, it makes it a lot easier. If you're slipping from one side to the other and the knockout range is right in front where you're slipping your head from one side to another, you've always got to come through that range. And Stipe, no matter where it is in the fight, has got that one-punch knockout power in that close range. So it's a different fight to when he faced Jones. It's a different fight to when he faced Gustafsson. And he's got to be careful doing that. He can't just come crashing forward recklessly because he knows that Stipe's got that knockout power. And at the same time, he can't stay on the outside and play that game with him because Stipe will stand on the edge and jab him, knowing full well that it's DC that's got to come and take the fight from him. So we've got to see the best version of DC in every range in this fight. And it's been a while since we've seen him at heavyweight, so we don't know how the lessons that he's learnt at light heavyweight are going to transition back into the heavyweight division. And we also don't know how Miocic is going to match up with him, given the fact that he's a very different fighter at close range to the other tall guys that DC's fought. So I do think it causes a lot of problems for DC when he gets inside as well.
OK, so when he gets inside then, what's his goal? What does he do when he's inside that range? What's he looking to achieve?
He's got to get his hands on him. The things we've seen DC do so well when he does close distance is slipping inside that range. The first clip against John Jones is one of the best clips I've pulled out. And this tells me that DC's got a really educated approach to a long-range fighter. Now, as you can see here, John Jones is standing in a southpaw position, so he's throwing that left hand. Now, John Jones, as I was talking about, has got really long arms, 84.5 inch. But when he throws this punch, he throws it long range. Now, that's not the kind of punch that Stipe throws. The place where DC's head is here is where Stipe's landing his punches with power. So you can see the full extension of John Jones's arm. DC's done an excellent job of slipping out the way. But he also knows that when he's level with the elbow, he's in a safe place because John Jones doesn't have that short-range power unless he switches to elbows. So what DC is able to do here is he slips to the outside of the punch. You can already see the other hand creeping up the back here. You'll see it clamp onto the back of Jones's head, and then he goes two big punches, actually knocks the mouthpiece out. We're going to see it come flying across the screen here. Look, way, here goes the mouthpiece. Like, very effective at getting inside people's range, obviously assuming that they're going to use long-range punches. So we know that he's got good head movement. We know that he likes to work inside the range. And then when he does, it's that single necktie and the big uppercuts. Most effective was against Alexander Gustafsson, who for some reason just couldn't seem to get himself out of this position. Was quite overwhelmed, quite stifled, because when you're a tall, rangy fighter, you want that space to work. And when you've got a guy that's short and compact and kind of right underneath you with his head on your chest, it's difficult to figure out what you can do in that range. Like, you can see Gustafsson, he was constantly trying to find space, and he felt very smothered by DC. And it's beautiful work. I mean, this single necktie into dirty boxing. The other thing you've got to think as well is the reactionary movement if you are caught with this single necktie. Because, as you know, John, if you pull down on someone's head, the first thing they want to do is pull backwards, right? So you've got to think, in this scenario, DC's pulling down onto the head of Gustafsson. Let me just put that in a different position so it makes more sense. So DC's pulling down on the head of Gustafsson here. So Gustafsson's natural reaction is to pull back. Now you've got to think, if your head's being pulled down and you're pulling, DC lets go of that. You come up and then he's straight in under your legs. So that changes things again. Now, it's something that could be very useful for DC in this fight if he can get into that range where he's got his hand on Stipe's neck. But getting to that stage is far more dangerous than it was against Gustafsson and Jones, in my opinion, because of that short-range power. So I would expect him to try and work his way into range with those big looping punches, slipping from one side to the other, coming over the top. He gets a hand on the back of the head and starts with the dirty boxing, but he can't stay in that range. The next stage is he's got to clinch him tighter, he's got to put him on the floor, he's got to nullify that size advantage by putting Stipe on his back. And it's that progression. We've got to see DC do the right things in a very educated way all the way through the fight. And I do feel like he's got to get the decision as well. I think he's going to really struggle to stop Stipe with anything.
The only thing that I'd say about that decision that goes in his favour is I can't help but think of another sort of term, but it's like being in a car crash with DC. Because he's hitting you with all kinds of stuff, which just your armour's going down.
Yes.
As it just crashes into you, and he's hitting you with all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
Cleaner work from Stipe, because I think when you get into that range, as I believe what you're highlighting is it's almost like a meat grinder.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a bit cleaner in that range, rather than DC, who is just confusing you and hurting you from all different angles. So how does Stipe compete in that mid-range with DC then? OK,
so the short-range power obviously is very useful. But what's surprising with Stipe, especially being the taller guy, is even when you put him in there against shorter guys, the likes of Roy Nelson and Mark Hunt, he actually opts to close distance and to put it on a much more physical Daniel Cormier kind of way than you would expect from a guy that's got a reach and height advantage. Quite happy to close distance down, get his hands on people, work knees and elbows in the clinch, and also threaten takedowns as well, which I think is still going to be a part of his game in this one, even if he doesn't plan on actually landing any. But this kind of overwhelming attitude that he's got is the same as what DC brings to the octagon. Stay on them, wear them down, beat them up. Like, look at that. I mean, Mark Hunt, literally, he got out of a takedown. He felt like for a second he was going to get a breather, and immediately Stipe jumps in. Look at this. So Stipe's elevating a leg, not even really intending on getting the takedown. The likelihood is he just wants to keep Mark Hunt working because he knows that a part of his strength is that conditioning. So he's here. You can see Mark Hunt limp legs out of it, and immediately Stipe's back to him before Mark Hunt's even managed to reset and prepare for him. And that was DC's advantage at heavyweight, was that he was able to put it on him before they could actually recover and reset. Again, with JDS, look, chasing after him, not really even interested in the takedown, but as soon as he's back to his feet, he's hitting him, and JDS is just trying to get a breather, leaning on him, sagging on them, uppercuts, dirty boxing, all the things that DC does so well, he's been doing to heavyweights in this division, well, for the past few years. And we've seen DC do it to the previous heavyweight division, the old school heavyweight division, which was Strikeforce, where the heavyweights were slower and a little bit more lumbering and a bit more power punching. Stipe has the power punching, but he also has the ability to go through ranges and maintain that pressure. OK, well, let's switch it up to the other side of the game then, the wrestling. Okay. And that is, I mean, it's the biggest primer for DC's game. His credentials speak for themselves. You're absolutely right, John. The foundation of DC's game is that Olympic wrestling pedigree. So everything else that he's added onto that is they've been bolt-ons to an already very, very strong foundation. Now, his takedowns they're amazing to watch. They're beautiful to watch. They're spectacular. They're highlight reel takedowns. But it's his ability to adapt and chain things together which really makes him so special. So where a guy is a good wrestler, DC is a great wrestler. And the difference between the two is the speed in which they make decisions. The ability to realise something's not working and switch it up. But also the ability to know how, biomechanically, you can pick up someone that's much, much bigger than you. And even if they are defending the first takedown, knowing how to adapt and to chain these things together is how he stays one step ahead. So I do feel like he is in this range. He does have an advantage against Stipe because he will be able to put these things together quicker. Now, We've spoken about this in the past, about how he likes to really elevate and throw people through the air. Obviously, you know, this could also all be just for the fans, just so people enjoy watching him fight. But I do think there's a tactical reason for it. Because if you're, hang on, let's just get Josh Barnett back up off the canvas. So if you think here, Josh Barnett is now, he's not used to being lifted up above somebody else's head for a start. Most heavyweights aren't used to being thrown through the air like this. But let's just have a look how DC's doing this. So he's on the outside, so his head's on the outside, which most of the time when people are running the pipe, they want the head on the inside. Putting his head on the outside shows not only he's very confident in his neck defence, but also his ability to chain so many other things onto this takedown. Worst case scenario, they stay upright and he just lifts them through the air. But put yourself in the mind of Josh Barnett here. So DC is lifting you up through the air, you're going head first, you're going towards the canvas, and at the same time, your hip's coming over your head. So as you land, you need to try and figure out your orientation in the world before you can do anything else. And at the same time, DC here has picked his foot up and he's landing 240 pounds on top of you. And because he's not spread out over a 6'5" frame, when the 5'11" frame of DC does land on top of you, it's so much more localised. It's not spread out. It's like dropping a kettlebell on someone instead of a bar.
Ouch.
You know what I mean? Exactly. Yeah. It's much different. It's much more of a thud. And he realises this, which is why he does allow his whole body weight to drop. So most of the time he elevates, he lifts, but then as soon as he feels like they're in a good position to let go, he just comes down on top of them. We've seen it so many times. I mean, the weight and the power. And then you've got to try and think about getting up. He even did it to John Jones, who obviously at 6'4" is very good at getting the toe to the floor and scrambling back up. But this is the one I'm talking about. This, if we watch this from the other angle, so let's just have a look at this. He's elevated him again. He's throwing him over the top, so he's throwing his hips over his head. Gustafsson's on his way down to the canvas here. He knows that DC is going to be landing on top of him. But what DC does so well is, as his fight is going down, he's let go of him now, look. He's completely released his opponent. He's not in contact with them. But as he comes down, before Gustafsson's even managed to figure out where he is in the octagon and how to get his feet back underneath him back to the feet, DC's coming out down on him with full weight, forearm on the head, and then he clamps onto him and he holds him down. He pins him to the canvas. It buys him a split second. And you've got to think, the further down the weight classes you go, the faster these guys move. So he was able to do this to Dan Henderson, who really was a middleweight. But he's also been able to do it to the heavyweights who, yes, they're bigger and they're more difficult to lift, but they move much slower once they land. And they're also not used to being thrown up in the air like that and then landing on the side of their head. I mean, I feel very much like it's a tactic to disorientate people, to buy himself a second, to really clamp them down and to hold them down, which, if we go back to the stats page back at the beginning, DC needs less takedowns to dominate the fight because technically he's better at securing them once they land.
It's great to see that he has a strategy that works across different weight classes and different body types, if you like.
And he's adaptable enough to make the most of it, no matter who he's fighting, whether they scramble quickly and they're difficult to control, or whether they're difficult to lift, but once they land, he's got a control of them very well. And
we talk about the wrestling credentials, but he's very much an MMA fighter. And I think once he gets a fight to the ground, as I'm sure you're about to show us, it's about damage. From that point, and he's so good at doing that.
Yes. Well, much like when he does take people down, like I was talking about, if he's got a 6'5" frame and you spread 245 pounds over that, 240 pounds or whatever he's going to be, it's a lot less localised pressure. Whereas DC is very good at hanging on people and making them carry his weight. You know, the Anthony Johnson fights really stand out to me because he broke Anthony Johnson. You know, it's less about landing with big power and breaking their face and more about landing regularly and consistently and breaking their spirit. You know, you see Miocic and he can hit you with that one-punch power and you're switched off before you even know what's happened. Whereas DC, you're there to witness it. It's like being beaten up with body shots. You're there to witness what's going on and you still can't do anything about it, which just, it breaks your soul. I mean, like these guys, they don't know what to do. Look at this. I mean, Volkan Oezdemir was on a tear all the way up to the belt. But then as soon as this happened, DC spreads himself across the shoulders. His whole lower body's free. But all of that pressure, all of that weight is localised on one position. And at the same time as him ironing out your arms so you can't do anything, his work rate's ridiculous. He's constantly tapping and banging and banging. It's a different type of power, but the volume is very much there. It just overwhelms people. So Stipe coming into this fight, he's not necessarily going to look at DC and think, knockout power, you know, he's gonna muscle me, he's gonna dominate me. It's the consistency. It's Stipe having to shut DC down consistently and regularly throughout the whole fight. And I really feel like it's the accumulation of effort from DC over the duration of 25 minutes, as opposed to the ability to switch him off with one punch like Stipe's got.
And just to answer the wrestling side of DC, and I think you mentioned it earlier, particularly against Mark Hunt, Stipe can wrestle.
Oh,
and
yeah.
there's a chance that he's going to use that in his fights.
Yeah, without a doubt. And again, we go back to the stats at the start. He's less successful with takedowns, but that's probably because he's not really that interested in taking people down most of the time. Right. You know, with Roy Nelson, it was just a threat, so Roy couldn't really commit to the overhand right. So if you think, again, DC's pushing forward with these big winging shots, usually that's to set up DC's takedown, because he wants to bring the guard up of his opponent to expose the lower body. Whereas if he's crashing forward with these big looping shots, but there's a threat of Miocic level changing and snatching a single leg, even if he doesn't get it, it halts that forward pressure,
sure,
much like it did against Mark Hunt. You know, we know Mark Hunt's a devastating knockout puncher, but when you think for yourself, I've probably got one shot, I'm going to use this really, really wisely, it does shut your game down. It makes you hesitant, which then allows Stipe to find his way in. So there are different, it's more of a line of defence. Think about it like that. If DC's being the aggressor in this one and bombarding him with mortar fire over the top, a line of defence for Stipe is just to snatch the lead leg away, or at least threaten it to force DC to defend, and then they're in a clinch. And the trade-off there is that Stipe's the bigger guy, the stronger guy, with more knockout power at that reach. So it is more of a line of defence for Stipe than anything I would say is wrestling. But this has always been said to me in boxing terms. You know, a good big guy always beats a great small guy. And although DC's probably got the advantage in the wrestling, he's got to be on his P's and Q's and consistent all the way through, because he's still dealing with a bigger guy. Even if they both step on the scales at 240, there's still a 5-inch height difference, and you've got to probably strip away, I don't know, 20 pounds of body fat off DC and give him muscle mass just so he can compete with Stipe on strength. They're very, very different. Like, the structure of their body is very different. And even though they might step on the scales as the same weight, Stipe's always going to be the bigger man. And the longer the fight goes, the more that's going to be apparent to DC.
I do, and I know that you don't agree with me this, I just think that DC tunes up, for his size, for the way he's built, he fights out of that body type so brilliantly. But I do see what you're saying, absolutely.
Yeah. But sorry, just to cut you off, but the reason that DC is so effective, though, is because he's relying on himself being faster and better conditioned and more tenacious than his opponents, particularly at heavyweight.
Yeah.
But you take all of those three things, well, DC's faster than most heavyweights, maybe not Stipe.
Yeah.
He's more tenacious than most heavyweights.
Well, because it's a different DC that we saw in Strike.
This is it. You know, he was a younger fighter then. His focus was on being in the gym all day, every day. His focus now is being the champion. So he's less active, he's fighting less, he's more focused on, you know, the peaks and troughs of being an athlete instead of just being consistently in shape all the time. Now, we know that DC shoots up and down in weight. I know on the Fox desk sometimes they have to get him a new suit because his jacket doesn't fit him.
He's going to be delighted that you've exposed that to the world.
But he'll admit that.
Yeah,
you know,
for sure.
He does blow up. He's a big guy.
Yeah.
But no matter how big he is, he's still going to be 5'11", and Stipe is still going to be 6'5".
Yeah.
He's going to carry that weight better, which means that weight's going to be more manageable for him. Now, that weight's really useful for DC if he's in a favourable position. But he's got to get himself to that favourable position and hold himself there for the duration of a fight.
Yeah. OK, well, before we...
upset DC anymore.
Yeah, before we upset DC anymore, there's one fight of Stipe's that you've reserved.
Yeah, yeah. It was his last performance, and this further illustrates my point. So, Francis Ngannou, terrifying. I'm even standing too close to the TV. It's terrifying. But Stipe knew what he needed to do to Ngannou. He's a big, strong power puncher.
He needed to DC him.
Exactly, he needed to DC him. He needed to do exactly what DC does to other heavyweights. When you're dealing with someone that's bigger, stronger, more powerful, you beat them up, you wear them down. That's what DC made a career out of at heavyweight, and that's how Stipe beat Ngannou. So now if you look at this fight, if you say Stipe did an excellent job of grinding Ngannou into the canvas and wearing him out and taking away that power, you then got to think that DC would probably have to have the same approach to Ngannou, but would he be as effective? Because Ngannou, in comparison to the heavyweights in the Strikeforce tournament, they're not the same beast. Stipe's not the same beast as you would have in the heavyweight tournament. They're very, very different. The heavyweight division's moved on massively. And a part of that, a credit to DC, was his influence in the heavyweight division when he first started out. Because heavyweights were looking at him and thinking, well, technically I've got all the skills, I have all the experience, but I can't keep up with his condition, and I can't keep up with his pace. But Stipe can, and we've had it proved to us in the Ngannou fight. He beat him comprehensively over 25 minutes. For me, it would be less impressive if Miocic had beaten him up for 2 rounds and subbed him. because then we wouldn't see Stipe go the full duration of a 25-minute fight and be consistent with that beatdown. We know that DC can do that, but we also know now that Stipe can do that. And the guys that we're comparing that they've done it to, Ngannou is by far the bigger, stronger guy. Do you know what I mean? Like I said, it's an uphill battle for DC, absolutely. Absolute respect to him for taking this fight. There's so much to be gained in this fight, and there's no reason why DC can't run away with this decision. But I feel like he's going to have to give a lot more and give a much better version of himself in this fight than we've ever seen before.
And do you think that there's perhaps a little bit more motivation for DC for all of the honours that are on the table here, and with an eye on the fact that he might only fight another couple of... I think he said, when I'm 40, I'm out. So history, pound-for-pound rankings, potential upshot of a Brock Lesnar contest maybe.
Yeah.
What do you think about all of those elements to this?
Yeah, well, you know, if you think DC's on the losing end of this fight, he still steps out of the octagon and goes back down to light heavyweight, and he's still the king of that division.
Yes.
So there's less to be lost here. He's thrown his name in the hat for a second title. Stipe's still trying to cement himself as the best heavyweight of all time. Now, he's done that. He's got more title defences than anybody else that we've seen in that division. But to then lose that to the light heavyweight champion would be a massive impact on his brand. He wants to continue this success. So there's so much to be lost for Stipe. There's so much to be gained for DC. So if you think of their motivations coming in, it's DC that's got to go and take it from the champion. Yeah. Because he's the challenger.
Oh, it's a big fight, isn't it?
It's massive.
Between two big guys.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's a great matchup. And this is really where we get to see what DC's like, you know, as an athlete, pound for pound wise. Yeah. Because his skills are certainly transferable. He just needs to make it happen on the night against the baddest man on the planet. Yes, who can extend his winning streak and continue that reign of history. What a fight it is. UFC 226. I cannot wait for this card, particularly this fight. Right. If you want to join the conversation, use the hashtag Inside the Octagon. We thank you very much for joining us. You can tweet at UFC Europe, and we will be back for the next pay-per-view. Until then, enjoy the fights.